reading them both, I was incredibly struck by the similarities in some of the themes and indeed some of the content and the sort of incidents addressed in the novels, which, as you'll hear, are incredibly similar, but massive differences as well. So I think we're going to have an interesting discussion, particularly in terms of some of the style that we'll talk about. So I'll just do a very, very brief synopsis. So, Stillborn, and these are both from the publisher's blurbs. So, narrated from the point of view of Cheyenne, an orphan from the Niger Delta, Stillborn is not only a tale of turmoil and tragedy, desperation and despair, but also one of optimism and opportunity. It revolves around the lives of 5 characters: Cheyenne, his mother Ranti, herself a girl of limited privilege; Cheyenne's lover, Aisha, a refugee from the religious clashes in the north; and Emeka from the southeast, a war deserter who becomes an unlikely hero. Their lives intersect in the residence of Dolapo, a civil rights lawyer from the southwest. And the 5 lives come together to paint a vivid picture of Nigeria since its infancy 50 years ago, meandering into the complexity of the lives and communities of present-day Nigeria. In the end, Stillborn traverses the various political epochs that have shaped Nigeria, and by extension, Africa in general, right from the pre-independence period and through the fears, frustrations, hopes and dreams that have characterized this fragile continent. So it's a bit of an epic, isn't it? It basically encompasses 50 years and about 260 pages. I'll do a very brief synopsis of Abubakar's novel, Season of Crimson Blossoms. In conservative northern Nigeria, the salacious affair between 55-year-old widow Binta Zubaru and a 26-year-old weed dealer and political thug with a very unusual name, Hassan Reza, is bound to cause more than a ripple. Brought together by some unusual circumstances, both see a need only each other could satisfy. Binta, who before the encounter is reconciling herself with God, has the need to unshackle herself from the sexual repression that characterized her marriage and a deprivation that has typified her widowhood. But beyond that, there is her desire to redeem herself for the loss of her first son, whose tragic death haunts her still. And so when the thug, Reza, whose real name not many people remember, arrives with a heart emptied by the absence of a mother who abandoned him when he was months old, and rekindles Binta's passion, they strike it off. As word of his unwholesome liaison with the widow Binta spreads and draws condemnation and social ostracism for Binta, things come to a head when Binta's rich son confronts the thug with disastrous consequences. So just to give you an idea of of what the books are about. But Dekoya, I'd like to start with both. Well, I guess for both of you, they're both ambitious novels in many ways, exploring individual relationships against a sort of socio-political background and exploring the history of Nigeria in some ways. Yours certainly has more of an epic feel, and as I said, you're covering really, it's from 1960 to 2010. You're covering a large expanse of time. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your aims were, what you were trying to achieve with the novel?
So the biggest inspiration for the book was Les Mis. I read Les Mis and I was blown away by the fact that you could pick up this book and you could be situated in Paris at a certain period of time. The culture, the religion, the political vibe, the angst, the way people thought, the way they dressed, everything was apparent in just, a lot of pages. Les Mis. So I was like, Nigeria is only 50 years old. There's certainly a type of attitude, there's a type of feel that must have resulted from independence, and I want to capture that. So that was the goal of Stillborn. But at the same time, I wanted to write an epic in which you would not feel compelled to skip a page. Because Les Mis, I skipped so many pages, it is so big. So it was supposed to be a concise epic, that was the goal. And I wanted to traverse the entire nation and just give a snapshot. So if a Nigerian in 100 years asks what was Nigeria in the 60s, they could pick this up and say, okay, this is a pretty good timeline of the first 50 years of Nigeria.
And when we were talking earlier, Dekoya, you were saying that actually you were more interested in sort of, I guess, documenting Nigeria than in the relationships and the characters.
So for me, Stillborn was the portrait of a nation. The characters were incidental. I wasn't trying to build any specific character or write around the character. All the characters came to me in completely different ways. Some were easy to write, some were difficult. But for me, the whole focus was, if I read this book, can I say I have seen Nigeria to some degree? And Nigeria was the subject. Like we were discussing earlier, I was saying, if this was a movie, you would call this probably the director's cut, because it's more about the subject matter as opposed to the characters portraying the subject matter.
Very interesting, and I guess in a way quite different from what you were trying to, or the way that you explore relationships in your book, Abubakar. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you were trying to achieve with Season of Crimson Blossoms?
Yeah, it's simple basically. What I was trying to achieve was to tell a good story. Basically, that's all.
By what means?
You know, I find the relationship between people intriguing. You know, how people relate to each other and what determines how they relate to each other. And, you know, for me, it started with exploring this woman who was just nagging in my head, and she wants me to talk and, you know, tell her story, and how she relates to the people around her, how she relates to this very unlikely lover that she has, and her children, who are all older than this boy she's in love with. Or man, he's a man actually.
He's how old?
So he's 30, sorry, he's 25, she's 55. So there's a 30 years age difference, and you know, so it was interesting how, you know, people relate to the fact that, okay, an older man who is in his 50s, 60s is dating a young girl who is in her 20s. So what if that case is reversed? What if it happens in a conservative Muslim community? You know, and what would be the issues that will come up as a result of having such relationship, you know? So those were the things I tried to explore.
So in a sense, yours is, although there's obviously the political context, there's the violence in Jos particularly against which the book is set, you were absolutely setting out to explore the relationships as your first priority?
It was principally about relationships between people, and how culture and religion and our beliefs, you know, shape the way we relate to people. What I was conscious of is that, you know, if Binta had been Elizabeth, born in Lagos in 1950-something, her life trajectory would have been different based on the culture, the religion, and, you know. So all those things came into play when I was writing the story, and in the end it became something else. It became, you know, sort of a mirror for the North to look at itself and analyze itself and see, okay, this is the culture we have, this is the way these cultures shape the people we are. And a window at the same time for people outside the North to look into the North and understand the North intimately, basically.
And I mean, although we're talking about the relationships as the sort of centre of the novel, there's absolutely the sort of this background of political violence, the violence in Jos, and then I guess also this relationship between Reza, the thug, and a senator who's like his sort of political godfather, which forms a background. And similarly, Dikoye, in your book, you have this the chairman and Emeka, who have this also very, very similar sort of a relationship of patronage. I was sort of intrigued by these sort of similarities, and also the sort of corruption and hypocrisy that was displayed through both of those relationships. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that particular relationship in your book in particular?
So there's a part in the book when Emeka moves to Lagos, and there's a chairman. And why this happens was because Emeka was the only Igbo student in his school, and the chairman comes for a talk and realizes this. I find in Nigeria, probably many African countries, there's a role the state is supposed to play, this sort of patronage to some degree. I know if I go to certain schools and I study certain things, I should have certain opportunities. However, in our societies, this 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. And so we tend to create informal ways to still, I guess, move forward. And so you will see sorts of informal patronage systems like this, I think, repeatedly in our culture. And that's why they will appear in different books in different forms because it's just inherent in the way we relate.
Yeah, for me, basically when I write, especially in the early days, I tried as much as possible to distance myself from my work, so I was trying to recreate experiences that are not necessarily mine. Yeah, but so which was precisely what was in the Whispering Trees, But I realized, it's sort of being, should I say, hypocritical on myself to not discuss and analyze the reality of the social cultural context from which I come from. And I was born in Jos. I grew up in Jos, and Jos has had a recent history of violence for almost 10 years. People who have been living together for hundreds of years started killing each other because politicians told them, oh, the Christians are your enemies, the Muslims are your enemies. And, so it was interesting for me because I felt, okay, in the news you hear reports about 200 people killed today, 500 people killed today, and that's it. Nobody talks about what happens to the family of the victims, what happens to the widows who are left behind, what happens to the children who have lost their father. So it was important to explore this and, analyze it and bring this issue to the fore. Yeah.
It was one of the things I noted particularly because, Dikoye, in your book as well, you also address the violence in Jos. I mean, in a really quite a different way. I mean, Abubakar, your way of tackling that is very much, I mean, there's one graphic scene, but it takes place within a domestic environment. So you are with this family in their house as the attackers effectively come into their space. Whereas Dikoye, yours, I guess the main one takes place in the church, but it's a much more public arena. It's very interesting the ways that the two of you tackle that differently. But what's for me most astonishing about this scene is the fact that you've never been north of Abuja. So I would love you to talk a little bit about how you constructed this scene.
So the section where that scene happens, that's my favorite character, Amina. Mostly because I was quite clueless about the North. And so it was where I was forced to do the most research. I'm an economist by training, so I enjoy research. That's what excites me, finding all this stuff that I didn't know about and inserting it somewhere. However, my scene is public just because of that. I am not familiar with the North. I cannot... Yes, I'm a writer. I'm supposed to imagine what goes on there. But I wanted it to be something authentic. I didn't want to say I'm situating it in a family home in Jos where I just have no clue. So that's why my scene happens in a public space. And I think for the scenes that happened in the North, I tried to do that as well. It was a lot of public space things and then personal opinions because I didn't want to uninform or misinform. I
mean, you certainly carry it off, but it's really interesting that for me the differences between the two, because I think Abubakar, in your book, we absolutely, and people have said this, that it's a window into a domestic life that I guess for most of us, if we're not from the North, we otherwise have no opportunity of accessing. And I guess this is something you're consciously trying to bring out.
You see, it's because of people like Dikoye that I wrote this book. Yeah. People who walk past a mansion and maybe hear people screaming in the mansion and assume, okay, well, somebody is killing somebody, or somebody is having a party, or somebody is having good sex. They have just an idea of the facade. And I don't know if research is enough to tell you exactly what's happening. You need someone in the mansion to show you. And we are those people in the mansion, and we've been quiet for centuries. So it's time we start making noise about this thing here.
And Dikoye, I mean, I think it takes a certain confidence to produce a novel like you have, this sort of epic, because you basically do cover an enormous amount of ground, and you're not afraid of. I mean, one of it was James Marura on his literature blog talks about it, sort of compares it to Forrest Gump. I mean, this guy Emeka, he's basically everywhere. He's in prison with Fela Kuti, he's just, everything that happens he happens to be there. Were you? I mean, did you have no doubts about that or pulling that off?
Well, I guess because I wasn't writing about the characters, I was writing about Nigeria. It made it easier to attempt these things. I did realize I was attempting to paint 50 years of a country's history in 200 pages. And I did realize I was attacking everything. Like, the war is in the book, the just crisis is in the book. So I tried to do two things. I tried to cheat a little bit by playing more with literature. So I didn't want it to be a long book. That was very that was something that was important to me. So I did literary tricks. Like, instead of, I was saying, I did snapshots. You walk into a scene in the north, I give you a snapshot. This is what I think the north looks like, or this is what I think the south looks like. But from then on, I stay away from descriptions as much as possible, and I try and let my writing describe the scene. So I had a lot of feedback from Nigerian reviewers initially. They were like, why is part one of your book so slow? And I was like, it's set in a village in 1960. I'm like, that is what it should be. It wasn't a fast time in Nigeria.
But would you like to also just expand a bit on stylistically the way you constructed this? Because, I mean, it's incredibly interesting the way that you've set this up. And Fela Kuti obviously had an influence on this as well.
Okay. So I tried to do two things with the book. I tried to make them authentic in that if you're watching it as a movie, for example, if you're watching a movie from the 60s, you expect old cars, you expect grainy scenes. So I did that with the book. The literature is old in the parts that are old. The way the scene is set, the way the scene moves, the choice of vocabulary, sentence structure, all that is to purposely give you a slow move. And then aligning with that, I was also trying to, so every part of the book is named after a Fela Kuti song. And in the first draft of the book, you were supposed to read that section in the time it takes you to listen to that song. And and the parts where like the song is quick, the book reads quickly, and the part when the song goes slowly, the book reads slowly. So I was trying to, I guess, create some form of artistic interaction with the literature.
So if you were to have the soundtrack, these songs, it would what? It would take you that length of time?
That is what is supposed to happen. Or that's how it happened with me. If I play the soundtrack of the book, and there is a soundtrack because it's every section named after a thing, that's how long it should take me to read the book. Yeah.
And these sort of very conscious references, I think, are interesting. I think for both of you as well, one of the things I was quite struck by is a very self-conscious referencing of other literature. Mm-hmm. So, Decoy, for you name, who do we have? Well, titles really. Lolita, Master and Margarita, 100 Years of Solitude, Animal Farm. These are all on a bookshelf with with Emeka's wife, right? Mm-hmm. What were you trying to do with that? What were you saying with choosing those titles?
So these were books that I particularly enjoyed. But for example, Master and Margarita, because of the title, because it talks about the devil jumping around Moscow, Nigerians are just like, oh my God, you can't read that, blah, 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 blah. And so it was part of the question we were having before about normalizing things versus making it an issue. And there were certain things I wanted to explore, and so I created a really, really weird scene, a woman in the middle of the forest during a war. And then I tried to normalize as many things I thought should be normal. Like, why is Emeka both Nigerian and Biafran? Like, for him, that is an issue. He's an Igbo guy that grew up in Nigeria, spent his life here. He celebrated independence as a Nigerian. Suddenly, he's being drafted to fight for Biafra. That is an issue. But it's things we don't talk about in our society because it's almost taboo. So I wanted to create a really weird space where we could normalize taboo.
And indeed, your characters say we don't talk about this, so it's very evident that's the message you're trying to get across. Mm-hmm. And Abubakar, similarly, your characters, they read a lot. I mean, I guess in that sort of domestic situation, it's the way in which the women particularly occupy themselves. And you reference for Binta, the main character, the widow. You have was she reading Hemingway, Danielle Steele? The younger girls are reading the Soyoya literature. Were you trying to tell us something about their characters through your choice of their reading material?
It's basically about being real to the situation on ground. A typical teenager in the North, a female, would most likely read Soyayya novellas. You know, that's the rave for teenagers. For someone like Binta, who is advanced in age, who is educated, you know, you'd expect something more sophisticated. And this resentment for this popular literature that teenagers read, with someone like Ustaz Noura, for instance, you'd expect him to read Fatul Majid and Qasasul Anbiya and other religious texts like that. So all these things have to reflect, you know, it's about capturing the texture of the setting of the novel, of the people who exist in this novel, you know.
And Abubakar, one of the things with your book in particular, that in the sort of these early days since you've published the past week or so, has been people's interest in the female sexuality, you know, in Binta's own sexuality, the fact she's a widow, the fact that it's perhaps, you know, an unusual situation, this 30-year age gap. When you were constructing the novel, and you write very convincingly from this perspective of this older woman.
Thank you.
But were you expecting any sort of backlash, the fact that you're exploring these issues that are really not told, these stories that are not told, and what's the reception been so far?
You know, for writing like a woman or whatever, perhaps I might have been a woman in my former life, who knows. In terms of backlash, I don't know. You know, it's perhaps too graphic for the typical northerner to grasp. You know, people are unwilling to acknowledge that sexuality thrives in the North, that people enjoy sex, and people are frustrated because they don't have good sex. And people do crazy things because they had good sex, you know. When you read the newspapers, you read stories about 67-year-old men or 50-year-old men who have